All right, everybody, we're back with another Power Monkey podcast for you. It's kind of an impromptu episode with all the craziness going on with COVID-19. Today is March 27th. We just want to give you guys kind of an update of exactly where we are on the timeline. And we're bringing back one of our guests from an earlier podcast who is as uniquely suited to give some interesting and unique information on what's going on than anyone else that we know. So we're really excited to have Mike Molloy back on, the owner of M2 Performance Nutrition. And Mike, thank you for coming back on at such short notice and being willing and able to kind of give some insight into what the hell we're all dealing with right now.
No, happy to jump on the call and kind of give my perspective on things. It's a rapidly evolving situation, but I think like everybody else, I'm trying to stay up to date, focus on facts, and hopefully we can relay some of that information to the community.
Can you, before we get into some of the questions, Mike, can we just can you tell everybody kind of some of your background when it comes to kind of what we're dealing with and why you're uniquely suited to discuss this stuff?
For sure. So let's start with what I'm not. So I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not an epidemiologist, which was sort of like how you study the spread of infections. What I am is that I have a PhD in viral immunology as sort of a specific area of focus. So I studied acute and chronic viral infections and specifically the immune response to them. I studied how we generate this thing called immunological memory, which is sort of the idea of once you get an infection once, it doesn't come back. I've been working in immunology since then, so going on like a decade and a half, so about 15 years now. And so I think I have a unique perspective, not that others don't have it, but at least for this community. And I can interpret a lot of the data coming out, the treatments that people are talking about. And so we can kind of walk through a lot of those subjects, and I can hopefully take some of these really complex discussions and kind of break them down for everybody so that they can apply them to their own lives.
Yeah. Mike, real quick, one thing, can you reposition your camera to angle it up a little bit more? I can only see about half of your face. There we go. Now, what a better picture there of you, Mike.
Thanks,
want
Jed.
to be able to see that face. But you made some really good posts on social media, Instagram, and I think really helping a lot of people out. So one, if the listeners out there, you don't follow, what's the tag there? M2 Performance, I believe, right, Mike?
Yeah, so it's M2 Performance Nutrition on Instagram. And in the last week, we've put up 3 posts that are really designed to try to help people out. So the first one was on this idea of, the consequences of social distancing. So I think it's very, very obvious that we need to socially distance right now. Like that's, almost unargued. But there are some downsides to that, right? There's some effects hormonally on the body. There's some effects, mentally, of course. And so we gave some suggestions on how to work through that as best you can. And then the second topic really comes down to, what we focus on a lot at M2, which is nutrition. And so people right now kind of fall into a couple different categories. Maybe they're bored and they find themselves eating out of boredom a significant amount. Or maybe they're really stressed and stress eating is a real thing, And so we have 2 posts, one on each of those, trying to help people work through those topics, so that they can not necessarily, stress about nutrition during this point in time, life. Like, let's be honest, nutrition and abs and all that stuff isn't the most important thing in your life right now, but just helping people, find a new sense of normal, right? And get back to a baseline such that they're not living in this, stress state or bored state 24/7, for potentially several months.
Yeah. Can we look forward to touching on all that for sure? Can we go back to social distancing? I think, that is of course it's a big topic. It's something that everyone it's being recommended to do. And I think, I've seen more and more people as time goes taking it more seriously. And obviously in the beginning, I even heard a story like where a guy said, hey, to one of his friends, I'd like to shake your hand today, but we're in social distancing, so let's just keep our distance for now. And jokingly, he comes over and gives him a big hug. A couple weeks later, they find out that, him and his entire family have
Right.
the coronavirus. So, those types of things where people are shrugging it off a little bit. Can
Mhm.
you just explain a little bit exactly what that is and why it's important? How does it work?
Right.
And then some of the side effects that you've found within research.
Sure. So at a really simplistic level, the virus, for the most part, is going to be transferred from human to human. So there's definitely evidence that it can live on, surfaces, cardboard, door handles, things like that. But the thought process is right now is that most of the transmission is occurring, from person to person through contact. And the research has been done sort of in laboratory settings to say that, if you're coughing, if you're breathing, things like that, there's about a 6 foot radius around you where, the virus is likely to travel from one person to another. And so providing, a distance between you and other human beings simply stops that route of transmission. And so if you can do this, or enough people can do this, then, sort of the rate of spread will decrease dramatically. We know that coronavirus is an extremely easily transmitted virus at this point. Um, and so taking this seriously and creating some distance is incredibly important to kind of slowing the number of people that are infected at any one given point in time. Because ultimately, as you probably see in the news, what happened in Italy, what's happening in New York, what will probably happen in a lot of different places is the healthcare system is being overwhelmed. And so it's not necessarily about completely preventing everybody from being infected. That's, a great goal, but unclear if it'll happen. What it is about is preventing everybody from being infected at once, which will lead to significantly increased mortality rates because people won't get the medical treatment that will keep them alive. So, that's all the pros of social distancing. The downsides to having to do this, um, there's enough research out there that we know this has some real like true impacts on the body of literally just being isolated, being feeling lonely. So there's some studies that have shown that people in social isolation have been shown to have increased levels of what we call like systemic inflammation, which is sort of like your baseline inflammatory level. So big within like the paleo community is decreasing systemic inflammation and things like that. That's kind of what they're talking about. At the same time, however, even though your baseline inflammation might be up, we know that your antiviral and your antibacterial sort of immune responses are decreased in this state, in this lonely state. Some really interesting research on that. Secondly, people that describe themselves as being lonely have been shown to actually induce a lower response to flu vaccines. And so what they did is they took a bunch of college students and they put them into two categories based upon, do they feel lonely or do they not feel lonely? And then they gave them a flu vaccine and they could see a measurable, correlative difference. And so it's not to say that loneliness caused them to have a worse, immunization response, but they correlated to one another. What else? So people that feel socially disconnected have increased blood pressure. They have increased stress response from like their nervous system. They have an accelerated rate of what we call like perceived aging. And in general, people that have a feeling of loneliness, that correlates with increased overall mortality, not necessarily to coronavirus, but just in general. So those are some negative things that kind of come with social distancing that we, if we know about them, we can try to push back against and fight back against.
Yeah, what you mentioned inflammation, and inflammation is something that I hear you talk about a whole lot, and specifically for this virus that is in question, why
Right.
is that so critical?
Yeah, great question, Chad. So we're learning new things every single day about like how the advanced disease happens. And so a lot of people are being infected, and the range of sort of responses, the range of symptoms that people are getting are dramatic. So obviously people are dying. They have a very large issue in their lungs, fluid accumulating, not being able to get oxygen air into their body, and this is ultimately causing them to die. And then on the far other end of the spectrum, people that are very clearly testing positive with a lot of virus in their body are completely asymptomatic. And we don't really understand that very well yet. But what we know is that these two different groups of people, if you look at how much of sort of like what we call an innate immune response. And there's this cytokine for people that are, that want to geek out on this stuff. It's called interleukin 6. And if you kind of put these two different, categories of people together, people that get this really strong acute lung inflammation that causes them to go into the hospital and need a lot of help, and then people that don't, you can see that this group over here, the really sick people, have way more, like 10, 100 times more IL-6 being found in their body. And that's what we call, this is what we call like systemic inflammation. Um, and so ultimately what might be killing people is not necessarily the virus, though of course the virus is the trigger. It's that your immune response is going overboard, and it's creating so strong of a response, and it's causing so much damage and so much inflammation that you basically kind of go into what's like almost like a localized shock in your lungs. And this is what ultimately ends your life. And so there's a drug out there. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but it blocks this molecule. It blocks interleukin 6, and it's showing a lot of progress or towards helping people that are in that state. And so, this is what I mean when I say like systemic inflammation and how it plays a role specifically with coronavirus.
Yeah, and speaking about ventilators as well, this is why the shortage is causing such an issue and leading to these deaths.
Yeah, exactly. So people that need support, there's more people than there are ventilators. And so doctors are having to make the absolute horrific decision about who goes on that support. And that's like, never mind the effect on the family and the person, of course, that may not get that support and may ultimately pass away. But this has some serious impact on those medical professionals as well. You know, um, People have looked at this type of situations in the past, and these people experience post-traumatic stress, issues and things like that. And so it it will have lasting effects on people. It will have lasting effects on our society of having to make those decisions for sure.
Mike, can we jump into the stress side of things for a second? You talked about
Yeah,
inflammation, but the creation of the inflammation through
sure.
stress and what those stress factors might look like, and
Yeah,
how we can potentially combat some of those.
exactly. So there's all different types of stress that can occur on the body, right? Mental stress, physical stress, emotional stress, and people are experiencing a lot of those now. Probably not so much, necessarily physical stress unless they actually have the infection, but 3.3 million Americans alone have filed for unemployment in the last like week. Um, they're being forced into social isolation. Their whole lives are changing. Thinking about our own little community, and it may seem insignificant in the bigger picture, but trainers and coaches that have for years now gotten up every morning and gone to work and interacted with human beings are now sitting at home and feeling a lack of purpose, a lack of things to do to make themselves feel valuable in the world. And so these are all different types of stresses, and we know that living in um, this stressed out state can cause hormonal issues. We talked a little bit about cortisol in our last podcast. Cortisol is your stress hormone. It can cause, increase your insulin resistance. It decreases your immune system response. It breaks down muscle tissue. All things that we don't really necessarily want to have happen. And then the second aspect of this is that your nervous system, to really dramatically simplify things, your brain has this component called the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is responsible for sort of operating all of the things that you need to live that you never actually ever think about, like digesting food and breathing and stuff like that. You don't sit there and go, okay, breathe, right? It just happens. And you don't think, oh, I'm just going to digest my food. It just happens. And so the autonomic nervous system has two different states, essentially. So it's got what we call the sympathetic nervous system, which is sort of more along the lines of like flight or fight. And then you've got the parasympathetic nervous system, which is more along the lines of what people call rest and digest or feed and breed. And so when you're stressed, you live in this flight or fight response. And this has significant impacts on how you sleep, how you eat, and things like that. And so that's going to impact your, all the things that we've been talking about. It's going to impact your anxiety levels. It's going to change your routines. It's going to increase your systemic inflammation. It's going to decrease your antiviral immune responses, we think. And so we really, as a community and as individuals, want to work hard to help people kind of get out of that stress state and give them some tools to, at least for a while, relax and, give their brain and give their body a break from that stress response.
And one of the things that we talked about last night on podcast too is one of the huge factors that not only, assists in getting nutrition under control, but also, dealing with stress is sleep, right? And we talked about this a little bit last night actually too, and how critical at this point is, everyone's home, everyone's not going anywhere, nobody's traveling right now. Like one of the things that we can probably focus on the most is what we're doing with our sleep. And what are your thoughts on kind of the importance and the factor that sleep plays in this whole thing?
Yeah, it's one of the four major pillars, right? So I'm not the only one that believes this, but I think there's four major pillars in, creating an appropriate sort of health, and appropriate stress response, and they're no less important right now. And so, nutrient dense diet, sleep, as we just talked about, activity, and stress management. So to focus on sleep, especially, getting 8 hours a night now, especially while your life allows for it, is going to, significantly impact your body's overall health, and it's going to, I would imagine, I don't think there's any probably direct studies on this, but I would imagine that it's going to improve your body's ability to fight off infections such as this, right? Or at least to create the appropriate immune response. Not to say it's going to stop you from getting it. I really don't believe anything, if you're exposed, is going to automatically just stop it. There's no magic bullet here. But it's about creating the best chance that you possibly have. And so getting 8 hours of sleep a night improves your immune response, allows you to hopefully clear this thing a little bit faster, a little bit more effectively, and prevents you from getting, so sick that you need, hospitalization type activities. So sleep's critical. Yeah.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about the symptoms for some people? Because, I think a lot of people out there are hearing different things. And, I myself was of the belief of if you don't have a fever, then you don't have it. But that's not necessarily true.
Right. So let's start sort of on the mildest side of things. So there's been some really recent evidence that suggests that the earliest, maybe I can't say it's the earliest, but one of the ways to tell whether you might have coronavirus but not really be feeling sick is sort of like a change in your sense of smell or a change in your like ability to taste things. And of course, those two are intimately connected. And so if you start to notice those things, I don't think you should go to the doctor and get tested, right? Like they're probably going to turn you away because there's just not enough testing kits in this country right now. But you probably should think about isolating yourself for a while and seeing kind of what happens. Seeing, if you start to progress further, or even just honestly being safe, taking 14 days and kind of hanging out at home, because that's a pretty clear correlation now that's out in the medical community is lack of sense of smell and lack of sense of taste compared to normal might be a sign. Next up would be sort of, there's a lot of symptoms that are coming out that are not just respiratory. So I think something in the order of a little bit below 50% of cases now have a gastrointestinal effect. So things like diarrhea, that, we have not heard nearly as much about that comparative to people that are having trouble with difficulties breathing and things like that. And so that's the next sort of thing. So, you're going to pop a fever, you're going to have aches and pains. It's going to feel like a really bad flu. And I think probably most people at some point in their life have had a flu. So fever, aches, chills, and all of that stuff. And specific to this, this virus, a little bit would be, some difficulty breathing comparatively. And if it starts to get worse, if you really start to struggle, then you absolutely 100% should go to the hospital at that point. But you want to call them first, or have a family member call them and let them know that you're coming, that you're having these symptoms. And so they can prepare immediately when you arrive there that you're not infecting more people, but you're going to go into isolation. So, that I think Chad kind of describes the range of, very mild and benign, nothing that's going to ultimately impact your life, all the way up to when you need to go seek some medical attention.
Yeah. How, getting into a little bit of a different topic here, or going back into one, how are you helping your clients through online right now survive the boredom part of this? How do you keep them from, as you say, eating everything in their pantry?
For sure. So let me kind of relay like an interesting sort of study that was out there. There's actually a couple of these studies, but um, so the one that we talked about in this post is they took a group of people and they gave them one of two different videos to watch. The first video was basically, I think it was sort of like an hour length film or documentary or something like that that was meant to be relatively interesting. And then the other video was basically the same tennis volley, like I think it's something like 18 seconds on repeat for an hour. And so they sat these people down and they got to watch one or the other. Um, and they gave them either chocolate, I think it was M&Ms, or they gave them a buzzer that when it pushed, it would give them a relatively moderate electric shock and cause a little bit of pain. And so then they measured to say, okay, are you more likely to eat chocolate when you're bored? And the answer, not surprisingly to people, was yes. So when they were watching this tennis match on repeat, they pushed the chocolate button and ate chocolate pretty consistently, or more so than when they watched the film. But what's interesting is that people also pushed this buzzer that caused them to experience a decent bit of pain as well, more frequently when they were bored watching this 18-second tennis match on repeat as well. And so the interpretation of this study is you will do almost anything to avoid boredom and monotony, including causing yourself physical harm. But if you have the preference, you will most likely choose to eat and hit your pleasure response in your brain with hyperpalatable food. So a really, really interesting study that that was out there um, to kind of get at this concept of like how boredom can cause you to just eat, basically out of doing something different than sitting there feeling bored. So yeah, interesting stuff. Now,
But
how
that
are we
pain
helping?
response can be in the form of a workout. Be like,
Yeah,
let's go do a
exactly. That's what I
workout
was thinking. Yeah.
and get through this
And
boredom as opposed to eating that chocolate bar.
yeah, man, the exercise thing is great for sure. I think people probably run the risk of never taking a rest day while
Hmm.
they're home and
Yeah.
bored, but that's maybe a discussion for another time in this talk. But yeah, so what can you do to kind of make this not happen? How can you at least prevent yourself from choosing food as sort of the stimulus? And so, like we talked about, the first thing is sleep. I won't belabor that point. Like if you're sleeping better at night, then your desire to go use food is going to be significantly less. Um, mindful eating. So we tell people that, like our clients, we want you to stick to your normal meal time. So just because you're home and you don't have to go to work doesn't mean you should wait 2 hours before you eat breakfast, because you might find that you're sitting there simply snacking on food and not really thinking that you've had a meal, and then all of a sudden you have a meal, then you snack some more. No, it's lunchtime. So stick to your routines. So that's another big one. Have your meals, have your pre-planned snacks, and things like that. Hydration is another big one. So thirst and hunger can often be confused for one another. So I like to start my day with a glass of water before even I have my cup of coffee, and then just try to keep that up throughout the day. So hydration is another great thing to kind of force yourself to do. And then, it sounds so stupid, but before you eat food, you have to put it on a plate. So no, picking while cooking, no, just taking things straight out of whatever the box and putting them in your mouth. Just simply put it on a plate and let it sit there for a second before you decide to eat it. And I think that just causes people to slow down just enough to you know to make it not like mindless, as opposed to like truly mindful eating. So those are some basic things that you can think about to try and um, get rid of this boredom based eating. And then the other aspect of it, of course, is finding ways to stimulate yourself, right? So if you can, set up calls with friends, right? So last night, the 9 of us, jumped on a call and, talked for an hour and a half. Like that's great. That's a great way to kind of, avoid feeling lonely and bored. Call up family, reconnect with people. There's 1,000 different ways to do it, but um, you know, finding ways to occupy your day. Maybe it's a good time to learn, Italian or Spanish or something like that. Maybe it's a time to jump on and, sign up for an online course in whatever you're interested in. Anything to kind of give yourself something to do so you're not just sitting there staring at screens all day long.
Yeah, you're asking a whole lot there, Mike, to have to put the food on the plate first. I need to take that advice for sure. I've just been reaching in the cabinet and in the refrigerator and snacking while I'm cooking. I'm breaking all the rules, unfortunately, there.
Yeah, man, you're not alone though. That's okay.
So, and you talked about inflicting pain. That is very interesting. But being that you said that it makes perfect sense. I mean, I
Right.
would rather pinch myself and feel the pain than sit there
Yeah.
and be completely bored. And
Completely.
some of that can be, as you said, Dave, lent to working out. Burpees are painful, so let's go do some burpees, right, to
Yeah.
pass the time and get into some pain. And you mentioned, Mike, the potential of people just working out every day, multiple times a day. I mean, it's kind of easy to do that right now. I'm
Yeah.
actually finding myself doing that. In fact, my
Same.
daughter is here and bored, so she makes up workouts throughout the day, and she makes me do them with her. And they're some of them have just been ridiculous. My calves are sore right now
Yep.
because she made me do like 500 jumps in 3 or 4 different ways in the same workout the other day. It was a lot of fun to do with her, but at the same time, as you mentioned, you know, through boredom, if we're working out multiple times a day, every single day, not taking a rest day, um, how can we keep from doing that?
I mean, yeah, I think, there's a lot of great online programs out there. And maybe just, finding people like the Power Monkey community, to give you not just these sort of like epic beatdown workouts, right? But maybe some stuff that you can still stay active and still, use your body and move and avoid boredom, but not crush yourself, every single day with ultra high intensity, which is just, let's be clear, another stress, right?
Hmm.
And so, finding that appropriate balance between, doing things that maybe cause a little bit of pain, to prevent boredom, but also finding some time to balance out that, if you want to work out more, I'm not going to tell you that that's a bad thing right now, right? Like that's fine. But, finding a smart community that won't let you go so crazy that you hurt yourself, or cause more damage than good. And then, yeah, like, it's hard for sure, but, maybe one day a week you take a rest day from the physical training, and maybe you do some mental training, right? You pick up a book, or, you do some self work or something like that. I think I think one unintended consequence of this lockdown is that people are having to spend a lot more time with themselves, and, some of these issues that maybe they've been avoiding, they don't really get to avoid them so much anymore. And so maybe having some strategies in place to kind of start to work through some of those issues might not be the worst idea in the world, and maybe the rest day is a good day to do that. So
Yeah, I find that I don't like myself as much as I thought I did now that I'm spending this extra time. No,
uh,
but yeah,
but
no, to go along with your recommendation there, what I took from that is basically, if you're going to work out a little bit more often, maybe make it routine or find a good program that has it all,
yeah.
packaged up so there's less random with it. And another
Hmm.
thing that I've been recommending to people is during this time, while you've got the time, if you've been having a hard time taking the time working on your mobility, if that's something
Yeah.
that you need, there's no
Yeah.
better opportunity to do that. And you can do mobility sequences, mobility drills that aren't really uh, going to add to intensity,
Hmm.
but it's
Exactly.
something that you can do to pass the time. So instead of doing an extra workout, do even 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes of mobility
Right.
work to hopefully, if this is something that a way that you can make it routine to take it
Hmm.
into your life once this is all said and done, that's a
Completely.
great positive that's going to come out of this.
Yeah, we haven't touched on it yet, but, this idea of dealing with like the stress of the situation, yoga, uh, deals with mobility and stuff, and so that kind of jogged my memory. And, that's a great way to deal with stress, right? Like an hour of just relax. You don't have the, screens in front of your face. Maybe just sort of following a program online in the background or something like that. That it's definitely a powerful tool, that, I know I don't use enough, and so it's a great point, Chad.
Now, do you find we've been talking about all these kind of negative issues and stress responses and everything else? Is it possible, in your opinion, that some people are feeling less stress? Maybe they're getting some needed time off from their job or working out, and it's kind of tough to say, but that's possible. And also a lot of, even though
Yeah.
we have this chance of feeling lonely and getting bored and being stressed from that aspect of it. I mean, in the end, a lot of us are getting a lot more time with our family, Dave. I mean, you
Completely.
get to play with Alessia more often. You know what I'm saying? So,
Oh yeah.
there are some potential positives of that. Do you see any of those?
Oh yeah, I definitely see it. I think this is if you can get past sort of like the initial shock of this is an opportunity, right? Like, assuming that things are good in your life and you're not feeling huge financial pressures. Like, I don't want to overstate the impact that this is having on a lot of people, but if you're in a good place, and this is an opportunity to do those things that you're talking about, Chad, and Dave, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. But I'm home a lot more with my daughter. My wife, she works in the medical field, so she's at the hospital, but she's home a lot more as well. And so, like, we're really, we're doing the best we can to take advantage of that time for sure.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I completely agree. I travel a ton, so I'm grateful
Yeah.
for the fact that I can be here and that I wasn't traveling and that I'm not quarantined anywhere away from my family, that I get to actually be here. My wife is 4 weeks away from, having our second baby girl. So the fact that I'm here and like helping as much as I possibly can, I'm grateful for all of that. What I would say is that, how far are we into this lockdown right now? 10 days, maybe 2 weeks for some people. I talk with my family in Italy quite a bit. Most of my relatives live in Rome. I have a ton of friends and clients that live in northern Italy where they're being impacted probably the most at this point. And they've been under lockdown a little bit longer than we have. And the reality of the situation is that there is potential for this to go on for quite some time.
Yeah.
And, you know, being in lockdown for 10 days and 2 weeks is very different than being in lockdown for 3, 4+ months. And my thought is, if it's tough now, we need to figure out ways to prepare
Yeah.
for a longer possibility to this. Like, not quite sure what your guys' thoughts are if this ends up dragging out, or what your thoughts are on, hey, there you go, Mike's
So
little
speaking of family things, I thought I would just show, this is my
li-
little
li-
my little stress.
lift up. There you go.
There,
Hello.
yeah, yeah.
This is my
Oh,
little stress reliever here. This is Avery. So, this is who I'm going to spend more time with every day. And
Exactly.
hopefully it won't be 3 months of spending more time together every day.
right,
But if it is,
right.
then I'll cherish every memory of it. So,
Yes,
Amazing, amazing.
so
So
there you
damn
go.
cute, man.
Yeah.
absolutely. And what a perfect example of, a positive coming out of this whole thing. But,
Yeah.
as you mentioned, Dave, what if this thing goes on for a longer period of time? We don't really, Mike, do you know of any time frames that are being put out right now?
So, I used this quote last night and I'll use it again. So, I heard this on a Chris Kresser podcast, which was asking when this is going to be over and when we're going to go back to life is kind of like asking a fireman when you can move back into your house while it's literally still burning.
Hmm.
We just don't know what the damage is going to be. And so I think, being bluntly honest, we're still really early. Some of the estimates that are coming out from really smart people say, 96 million people will be infected with this type of, this thing. And right now, the confirmed cases are something in like the mid 500,000s, but the estimates are that it might be about 10 to 11 times the number of people have been exposed than are being tested. So
Hmm.
let's just call it whatever, 6 million or so. We got a long ways to go
Hmm.
before that. And so if we get this all kind of, I hate to use the term, so forgive me for it, but like out of the way in one big
Yeah.
fell swoop, then it could be, 3, 4 months. Um, but there's the potential for, like, if things kind of shut down and then people start to go back their lives and then we get another big spike and then we have to shut back down again. There's some really scary long-term estimates about like multiple phases of quarantine
Mm.
to kind of get us through this. And so it's really hard to say, but I think the best thing that we can do is just sort of, you know, be careful now. Let every day that we don't overwhelm our medical system is a good day, because companies are out there making protective gear for people. Um, you know, Drug companies are massively increasing production of that drug I talked about, the IL-6 blocking antibody. They're literally making as much as they can 24 hours around the clock to get it to people to try to save lives. And every day that we wait, every day that we delay, more of these things are being brought online. More ventilators are going to be made and shipped all around the world, right? Like, it's really interesting. Like Rogue Fitness, big component of, our community, they've dedicated a substantial part of their manufacturing to making masks now, And so companies are coming online to try to help and try to solve these things. And if we can just push a delay into this system, even if the rate of infection increases, but it takes us a month to get to that increase, then we'll be, a little bit better prepared and fewer people have to die. And that's kind of what it's all about at this point. So.
Yeah, I think, Mike, that's such a huge point because, it's that flattening of the curve idea, right? And, you hear there's a lot of kind of voices on both sides of this right now saying, the economy is going to be hit so hard by being on lockdown for so long. Like the ramifications of the economy being what's going to happen to the economy is going to supersede or surpass the amount of lives being affected specifically by the illness itself. And I think the point that you made, which is a really important one, is that we're trying not to overwhelm the healthcare system. Like, it's most likely inevitable that a significant portion of the population is going to be infected at some point. We're just trying to prolong those infections and not make them all happen right now because our system can't handle that. So we're trying to do the best we can by socially isolating or by, doing things to prevent you from getting it at all costs, so that if you do get it, let it happen later on when there is a ventilator available, when there is, a potential additional drug available or a vaccine or a bed, a medical bed. So the concept there is to prolong the need for mass people being dumped into hospitals so that we don't overwhelm our doctors, hospitals, and bed space, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of a really good point, right? So, like, I'm not an economist. I can't tell you what the impact of having all these people laid off from work are and how many people might, die as a result of that. That's a really complex question to answer. But, I think you triage the situation, right? Like, as best you possibly can. It's like if you get into a car crash, and you hurt your head and, there's a bone sticking out of your arm, but you've also, you've got a pretty good bruise on your ankle. Like, you got to solve the biggest issue you can first, and right now it's delaying that curve so that we can get more things in place to help people when they do get sick. There's some really scary numbers out there when you look at the countries that, kind of dealt with this first, that were unprepared. And I think they're probably conservative numbers, right? So the death rate, even not knowing all the infections, is dramatically higher when the medical system overwhelms itself. And it's not just old people, right? Like, people that are in our age group, I'm 38 years old, like, they're getting really sick and they're passing away, And so this isn't just an elderly problem. This isn't just a sick person problem. This is something that's going to impact all of us in some capacity or another, or has the potential to, maybe is a better way to say it. So yeah, I think until we learn more, it's the best strategy is like to be conservative and safe with our approach and go from there.
So
Yeah,
on a positive, go ahead, Chad.
Go ahead, Dave.
I was just going to
ask on the topic of numbers, is the saying that 30% of Americans on estimation will end up getting this?
Yeah, so there's a couple of epidemiologists that put that out there. Some on the order of 30% at some point will eventually contract this. The question is how much we isolate and stuff before we get to a vaccine. We should be able to make a vaccine for this. It shouldn't be impossible. It's just going to take some time to get it right and to make it, effective, because that's the most important thing. You don't want to put a vaccine out in the market that's not super effective. That would be devastating. And so, that's just going to take some time. But the more we can kind of push this curve, the fewer people will actually have to get infected. So. Dave, what were you going to say?
Yeah, my question just comes back to, okay, the countries that were early hit by this, China, Italy, South Korea, Iran. Yeah. Yep. Some are doing a much better job of, flattening that curve and getting things in order than others. And it's starting to hit the U.S. Pretty significantly right now. Yep. I think yesterday they said, we now have the most cases out of any country in the world. We now surpass China, with the numbers that are actually available. Sure. What is allowing some countries to get things in order, and what is causing, in your mind, certain countries to fail in certain areas in terms of, limiting the spread?
Sure. So some of it is some of the things that we take as a real benefit, right? So social liberties and freedom and things like that, and not having sort of, it's such intense governmental control of our lives. And so, some of these countries live in a much more regimented, government controlled world. And so when they say things stop, I think it was China, for example, they basically said every new infection case that they have, we're going to apply a team of 5 people. And those people's job is to figure out, okay, let's say Dave was infected. We're going to see who Dave talked to, saw, and touched for the last week. And he's going to write down those names of every single person. And they're going to go find those people. And they're going to say, you don't leave your homes for 2 weeks, period. But they didn't stop there. They talked to those people and they said, okay, tell me every person that you come into contact with in the last 7 days or 14 days. And they said, okay. And they wrote down those names and they went and found those people. And they said, you're going to stay home for 14 days as well. And so they basically went like 3 levels of connection away to try to get people to stop moving and stop the spread of this. They shut down transportation across, massive parts of their country. That's not happening here in the United States, right? Like I know for a fact I'm seeing a significant number of New York license plates in our, New Hampshire, Vermont, community up here. Can't blame people, but like that did not happen in China, right? Like once they understood the severity of this, they like shut it down, right? They stopped immediately. And that just like due to the nature of our society and the world that we live in here in the United States, that's not how we operate, right? We have a different government, a different culture. And that, contributes, I think, to a lot of this. You talk about like Italy, that's a much more Western culture. They took a lax view on this. They didn't really understand, I think, what the potential impact could be. There were some really interesting quotes, coming from the leadership out of Iran, where they basically thought that, plagues and things like that were a thing of the past and that they didn't happen in the modern world and that this is not a big deal. And then, one of their internal, people died relatively early on and they said, oh, shit. And they started to put some things in place, but the death rate in Iran is insane. Like it's approaching 10%, according to the stats that are out there. And so, I think there's some lessons to be learned. And I think, unfortunately, we're probably more Italy than we are, Hong Kong or South Korea or any of those countries when it comes to the response that we took and the speed with which we took it as well.
And numbers right now, in terms of death rates, from what you're seeing, the numbers that I've seen from media outlets and things like that, flu is normally like a 0.1% death rate. Is that correct?
Yeah. Something in that range, yeah.
Like SARS and MERS were closer to like, what, 2%? Something around there?
Yeah, so there was a H1N1 actually had a relatively high one. I can't remember the name the number off the top of my head, but it was like significantly higher than a couple of percent, but it was transmitted significantly slower,
Okay.
And so, or more difficultly is maybe the way to say it. And so, that kind of, even though it might have been ultimately more, quote, deadly, the number of people getting it and the way to shut it down happened a lot more easily. At this point, if you look at, so Johns Hopkins has a really great website out there basically dedicated to coronavirus numbers and stuff. And so the number of total confirmed cases is something around like 560,000, I think, as of this morning, with 25,000 deaths. Now, if we estimate that something on the order of, so that'd be about 5%, right? Maybe a little less than 5%, 4.5%, something like that. But if we estimate that about 10 times the number of cases aren't even being, recorded, you can just basically cut that back by a factor and say that, of the people that are being infected overall, the death rate might be something in the range of like 0.5 to 1%. But that's still a lot of people,
Mm-hmm.
There's something like 7.2 billion people in the world.
Well, yeah, I'm just trying to do the numbers.
Get that, but a lot.
Just trying to do the numbers of that right now, just so people get some perspective. So you're saying on the conservative side, maybe 0.1%. So 1%, not 0.1%, 1% would be the number of people that would actually.
I would say 1% is probably like a little bit on the like liberal aggressive side, right? So just because we don't know how many people, but let's say, we know how many people have died from this roughly. And even that number might be a little bit low, right? Like there's some estimates saying that, the number of people dying in Italy are twice what's being reported, and they just don't know that it's from coronavirus necessarily.
Right.
But let's just say the numbers are accurate.
Right.
So, 25,000 out of roughly 550,000 confirmed cases. So approximately, 5%, but we assume that there's 10 times the number of cases out there. So we'll call it 0.5%. So 0.5% is probably a pretty decent estimate at this point.
So 0.5% of taking this to the U.S. population, 330 million people, 30% of those are going to get it at some point. 0.5% is 50 million people.
Yeah, so I think it's closer to
0.05,
so
5 million people. It's 5 million people. That's 5 million
Yeah.
people potentially dying from this, just in the U.S.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the epidemiologists are much better at this than I am. And there was a great interview with one, I can't remember his name right now, on the Joe Rogan podcast. I think you guys have seen it.
Yeah.
And so they estimated that 96 million Americans will get this, and that there'll be a significant number of hospitalizations and upwards to 500,000 deaths. And so I think that's probably the best numbers to use for the current state. And so that's a lot of people. That's a huge impact on the world. And, we're honestly, like, our population isn't that big compared to some of the countries out there, China, India, all these countries. And so, yeah, man, I think that when you realize those numbers are potential, you get the perspective that we're still so early into this process, right?
Yeah.
I think it wasn't even Monday, I think, when that number was barely breaking 150,000, right? And now we're at 550, and it'll probably be 1 million by Monday,
And so some of that is just that testing is becoming more readily available, right? So it's not that potentially the number of cases is skyrocketing, it's that people are actually being tested and showing positive.
Probably both.
Yeah.
It's probably both. So, like, for example, New York came online with their own test. They said, we're going to make our own. And they started testing way more than anywhere else in the country. And their confirmed cases skyrocketed. But, the number of cases that are occurring in this country it's almost undoubtedly growing exponentially. We're on that sort of, like, so the slope, maybe this way, is coming and, inflecting in a big way. And then it eventually will lean out at the top. We're in the vertical phase of that right now, for sure.
Yeah. Chad, do you want to go through some of your Chad, we talked about this a little bit last night, and Chad's a little bit of a conspiracy theorist, and I would love to hear a couple of Chad's theories and Mike's thoughts on a couple of his
Well, no, I was just about to ask that, but I was going to ask you, Dave, first. Speaking about Italy quite a bit here.
Yeah.
How's your family over there doing?
They're doing okay. I speak with them as often as I possibly can. The majority of them are in Rome, and they're all locked down. They are safe. I have a lot of aunts and uncles that are old and in a demographic that is highly susceptible to this in their 80s. Italy has a very aging population as it is. They just have quite a large number of people that are, over 60, 70, 80, a lot of people that would probably be hit hard by this. My family is doing well. We haven't had any issues as of right now in terms of infections. I have a lot of clients actually in northern Italy, and I've been talking with them a lot as well. And the tone from them is definitely a little bit more dire in northern Italy, and you can tell that they are a little bit more on edge than the people in central or southern Italy. But it definitely is real, man. They're not sugarcoating it. They're saying it's a very scary situation for them out there, and they're trying to get us to understand the severity of it. They want us to know in America that it's not something to just kind of gloss over. It is very real, and it's affecting them in a pretty severe way.
Mike, you mentioned that you felt like their response wasn't as solid as some other countries, and with the U.S. being potentially in danger of following that. How far behind the impact of Italy are we? Are we a month behind them?
No, it's more like 10. I think like 10 to 14 days,
okay.
Right? So I think we're just coming into. So I remember, what was it, Dave? Probably maybe like a week, 10 days ago, when like the news outlets started to come out, basically being like, yeah, the hospitals are overloaded and we have no idea what to do. I remember listening to an article where an Italian doctor basically went onto Twitter, I think, and was like, this is what's happening. People are coming in and we're deciding who's going to live and die. And I feel like that was about a week to 10 days ago. And so now we're here, right? And I think we're just about at the precipice of that here in this country, and some really, it's going to be like pockets, right? So it was like a big pocket in northern Italy. I think there's going to be a pocket in New York. There's clearly going to be a pocket down in Louisiana. Mardi Gras happened and people went and, lived it up. Possibly Massachusetts, right? Like there's a big St. Like Patrick's Day attending, going on all throughout the city still. And so those things have the ability to make the transmission rate super, common and kind of spread it. And now those are just going to start to become symptomatic, and those people are just going to start to feel sick and about now. So we're about there. We're just kind of in that inflection point. And, we have information from my wife's hospital, and they're basically saying they expect the surge to occur in the next 7 to 14 days. So,
okay. So the surge in those specific pockets.
yeah, I think it's going to happen. I think it's going to happen a lot more for sure. But, those are just examples.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now we can definitely get back, Dave, into what you were talking about. And, it's not necessarily that I am hardcore and believe these things. It's just that I wouldn't at all be surprised if, any of the theories out there are true, I guess. I believe that anything is possible. Mike, how do you feel about the potential of this being man-made?
So I think science pretty much has done a pretty good job of saying that that's not happening. But I think it's a good topic to go over. So there was a study done by the Pew Research Center. So those are the guys who do like all the political pollings and things like that. And they estimated that something in the range of like 29% of Americans believe that the virus was created in the lab. Politicians are accusing the Chinese of engineering this. The Chinese are accusing the United States of engineering this, or certain people are at least. But when you look, at the science, and so there was a publication that came out, published in Nature Medicine, which is one of the best journals in the entire world, published March 17th, 2020. And they basically went through and they looked at the genetics of this thing. And they said, this is the seventh, known sort of coronavirus to infect humans. And so, this is not the first. This is not even the first one that's caused some issues, right? They also have other ones called MERS and SARS, what was it? HQU1, NL63, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to go down that road. But they basically went into genetics and they said, look, this just looks like a modified, mutated version of the previous ones that we've dealt with before. And so, you can see kind of where this came from. It was a different version of a virus that probably at the time was, not able to infect human cells, right? There's this thing called tropism, which basically stands for what types of cells a virus can infect, right? And so, for example, with the annual flu, basically one of the strategies is you take this thing that you think is going to infect humans and you just grow it over and over and over again on chicken cells until it no longer affects human cells, but it infects chicken cells really well. And then you can use that sort of attenuated version of that virus as like a potential vaccine. And so nature essentially did this in reverse. It was probably some virus that was floating around, people are saying in bats, that couldn't infect humans. And then some little mutation and change, which viruses are doing all the time, happened. And then it could, right? And so one person in a market got exposed, it incubated in their body, and then that person released it into the people around them, and then them, and then them, and it kept growing and growing and growing. So the evidence is out there to suggest that this is extremely not man-made.
What about the theory that this came from a guy eating a bat?
I have no idea if that's potentially the cause or not, but it certainly could be something along those lines, right? Basically, maybe not eating, but just interacting with, right? Being around. Maybe it wasn't eating the bat itself, but maybe the bat, had some droppings on something that he did eat, and something that or maybe he touched, bat poop and didn't wash his hands, and then when he ate, he put it into his body. So, the general concept of it coming from another species that this person interacted with are probably pretty strong. Whether or not he ate the bat or not is another thing entirely.
Yeah,
I
that's
got it.
probably
I got
something that if you have that in your cabinet, you probably don't want to eat that, right?
It's- yeah, in
Save
general,
that for the
probably avoid
last thing
these
you eat in your
exotic
pantry. Right?
animals.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I have another question for you that we talked about last night while we were all together. Just with regards to how long it can last on objects, the virus lasting on things like cardboard or on metal, or if a package gets left outside your door. What are the realities when it comes to that? Even, us having the ability to go to a store for,
sure.
necessities. What's the reality when it comes to it lasting on something like
Yeah.
that?
So I think it was the New England Journal of Medicine, which is again probably one of the best journals in the world, published a study on this, or someone like them did. And to make a long story short, we know that this virus can exist on surfaces for more than a few hours in probably less than 5 days. The average time in a laboratory setting looked at like something like 2 to 3 days, for something like a cardboard box. And so ultimately, I think you could probably drive yourself crazy thinking about all the different surfaces that are out there that you could potentially be contaminated by. And I don't think that's a good idea. What I think is a good idea is to constantly be washing your hands throughout the day. You know, when I say constantly, I don't mean, every 5 minutes or every half an hour or anything like that. But if you go out in the public, before go touch things in your house, like have some disinfectant, have some soapy water. Don't be afraid to clean your house pretty consistently if you really, really want to minimize the chances of being infected by this. Yeah, good question.
And with soaps and things like that, we've heard a lot about like what the appropriate way to wash your hands is. You have to wash for at least 20 seconds.
Hmm.
What about the difference between like an antibacterial soap versus just a regular soap that you might find in your bathroom? We're seeing so many
Yeah.
antibacterial things and being flown off the
So I
shelves.
think in general, yeah. So I think in general, there's some evidence to suggest that like during normal times, antibacterial, like the more intense soaps, maybe not the best thing to use for reasons kind of like right now, even though this is clearly a virus and not a bacteria.
Right.
Um, but right now, the more potent of a sort of killing thing that you can have against viruses, the better. But I think in general, most soaps that you're going to find in stores are going to do the job as long as you're washing your hands for more than 20 seconds. It's going to significantly, significantly, significantly reduce the chance of infection. So maybe this isn't the time for the most exotic soap that you found at your local, farmer's market, but time for a standard one that you're going to pick up at the grocery store. I'll be bluntly honest, I have no evidence to support or deny that claim. I think it's just my own common sense.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Well, the
um,
farmers market might have coronavirus on it, right?
the exotic animal
Yeah,
market. I don't know
exactly.
what kind of ones you go to, Chad, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, I am from Oklahoma, so they're a little more
Yeah,
interesting down here.
patient zero for sure of something down there. That's for sure.
Can
And that's going to be a final recommendation, right, Dave? Watch the Tiger King, right?
Oh yeah, if we go into that, that's a whole nother podcast. But yes, if you haven't watched Tiger King, I
So,
throw all of my support towards it.
so maybe what we can do, just as a suggestion, is so there's, like I was saying, there's nothing that's going to like overall just absolutely stop you from being infected if you're absolutely exposed, right? So if you see, if you come into contact with this, the chances of it, infecting you are what they are. But I think there's probably some things that outside of what we talked about, so stress management, nutrient dense diet, activity, and sleep, that, you could probably start to focus on just to kind of um, give yourself the best chance possible to kind of fight this off without really needing to get intense medical attention. So, thinking about food, there's been some antiviral properties from garlic and ginger, citrus fruits as well, bell peppers, on the sort of, that's on the viral fighting side of things. On sort of the anti-inflammatory aspect stuff, trying to keep that systemic inflammation we talked about, turmeric or curcumin, fish oil, bone broth, all have been shown to be sort of good for kind of decreasing all of those things. Probably not bad to have on hand. And then on a supplement side, zinc has actually been shown like a couple of years back to be good for fighting or preventing infections of coronavirus, or like preventing spread of virus within your sort of like within your body. So you might want to just grab some like zinc lozenges. Zinc copper lozenges would probably be the best. And then just let it dissolve in the back of your throat, maybe while you're laying down, to kind of, help gravity send it in the right direction. That probably wouldn't be the worst idea in the world. There's very little downside. There's very little risk of bad side effects coming from this. Additionally, elderberry, which there's about 1 million different companies out there selling gummies and things like that, actually has been shown to be decent at this. Again, not preventing viral infection, but maybe just helping, decrease that viral burden a little bit to, a more manageable level for your body to fight. So elderberry gummies could be something as well. And then there's a whole bunch of other, sort of adaptogens that are out there, things like astragalus, which we could talk about, that really don't have specific data for coronavirus, but have been shown to help improve your body's sort of overall antiviral immune system. And so those are things that you could think about including into your diet. So garlic, ginger, citrus, fruits, bell peppers, turmeric, fish oil, bone broth, zinc, elderberry. Those are probably the major recommendations. You could probably drive yourself crazy.
Do you have these on your website, Mike?
We don't, but maybe what we can do is I'll send them to you guys. You can toss them in the show notes and things like that. So yeah. So again, this is not medical advice. This is not meant to supersede medical advice, but these are things that I'm personally doing in my own life to try to just say, okay, if this happens, how can I best prepare my body to kind of to fight it using as much science as out there for something that is extremely, extremely, extremely new.
For sure.
That's fantastic.
And to go along with those recommendations, Mike and Dave, Dave, you listen to more podcasts than I do. Do either one of you guys have a couple of those podcasts that we were talking about earlier that you could recommend for anyone to listen to on this topic?
Yeah, on the podcast front. So I'll try to do a quick search here. So Joe Rogan did a podcast on COVID-19 with a gentleman named Michael Osterholm. It's episode 1439. That's a really good listen. He probably has his own agenda. He sells a book on sort of, epidemics and things like that. So, take it with a grain of salt, but he is a professor, I think, at the University of Minnesota, and very, very educated on this topic. So that would be a good one to follow for sure. And then on more the health side of things, there's a lot of people putting a ton of information out there. But I think most of it's going to be in line with what I just said, at least if they're scientifically minded and really trying to focus on things that, have strong evidence behind them versus a little bit more voodoo.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think anytime I hear Dr. Fauci talking, whether it's on a podcast or news feed or speaking to Mark Zuckerberg or whatever it is, I try to tune in because he seems to be a really good voice on this right now.
Yeah, Dr. Fauci, he's been doing work in this sort of world since the AIDS epidemic began in the United States, and so he is a voice of intelligence for sure, and someone to be listened to in a serious way. His recommendations and his suggestions would be some of the most accurate and experienced in the country, probably in the world.
Mike, I just have one last question for you. Is that all right?
Sure.
If I keep around for one more quick one.
Yeah, no worries.
So, and it's just a little bit more personal, and I know that a lot of our listeners might have a similar issue, but with my wife being pregnant, hospitals are being overwhelmed. We've heard, especially in New York, we have a bunch of friends and family that are about to have babies in New York City and are being told that, you can't go in with a partner anymore, and a lot of people are being a little bit scared about going in and having a baby at this point. Anything that you've heard in terms of it affecting pregnant mothers, affecting a child being born at this point? Anything that you've noticed?
Really great question, Dave. So there was a case report that this virus, so SARS-CoV-2 is the name of the paper, is not transmitted from pregnant mothers to their infants. So this is called vertical transmission. It can definitely occur for a lot of things during pregnancy. It happens for sure with hepatitis B, chickenpox. It can happen with HIV, etc. But a recent report indicates that the COVID-19 virus is not transmitted from pregnant mothers to infants during the birth process. So that's important to talk about. The report that I'm talking about describes 4 live-born full-term infants born to pregnant women who had tested positive for COVID-19. This is all occurring in China. 3 of the 4 infants did not test positive for the virus, The mother of the fourth infant did not provide consent for testing, so we don't know what happened with the fourth baby. None of the infants manifested any clinical signs of COVID-19, no respiratory issues, no gastrointestinal issues. 2 had some rashes at birth, but if you've ever seen a child born, they often have rashes. One of the infants, let's see, rashes, so rashes or breathing problems were not considered to be related to COVID-19. 3 of the babies were born by a C-section, 1 was born vaginally, and none of them tested positive for the virus. So all of the babies were isolated after birth and formula fed. So that's all I can say about that. So if mom were to have, a positive test for COVID, or to potentially think that she might have it, then this might be one of those situations where, unfortunately, the recommendation may change from not breastfeeding to formula, just to kind of prevent the baby from getting exposed. So those are the only real studies that are out there right now that I could find in advance of this talk, but they provide good evidence that at least for 3rd trimester pregnancies, going into the birthing process, that the birth itself will not, contaminate the baby. It just might cause some sort of, emotional and physical stress afterwards if the baby is then pulled away from the mother, to kind of prevent that baby from being sick. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah,
I'll be able to pass it along to Sadie. I think she'll be happy to hear that.
Yeah, that's great to know for sure. And I have one last question for you as well, Mike, if that's okay.
Sure.
How many times have you watched Top Gun during quarantine so far?
Just once, but after last night's chat, I think it's going to be on the agenda for today, because I got an itch, and I got to scratch it, right? I feel
Exactly.
the need for speed. So
I'm surprised it's only been once. So I'll have to check back
well,
in with you in a week or so.
Chad, the baby that I put on this camera earlier has this dictatorial relationship with my life. And so the ability to sit down to do anything for more than 2 hours is pretty difficult. And when she does sleep at night, I also sleep. So yeah, that's the problem. It's all her fault.
That is understood. That's absolutely understood. Well, hey, we really appreciate you being on with us once again, Mike. Did you have any final thoughts or anything else you wanted to share with the listeners?
Just stay safe out there, guys. Keep doing the things that you're doing now as it relates to social isolation. But also, don't be afraid to use these amazing technologies like we've got now to reach out to people, including to me. You can find me through the Instagram tag below my face here, or you can find me through the M2 Performance Nutrition site. So if you need help, I don't care about the nutrition stuff aspect of it. If you just need help, reach out to somebody, because we're a great big community, and we want to help each other. So yeah, that would be it.
Awesome. And Dave, is there anything, through this tough time that we're all going through that is going on with Power Monkey, that's anything coming up that you can share with the listeners?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we've had to cancel, as expected, all of our events over the next few months. We canceled our Camp 13, unfortunately. It was happening in May. It was a really hard decision for us, but I think obviously the right one at this point. Right now, we're just trying to be in contact with our community as much as possible. What we are going to be doing, that'll be unveiled on Monday, which will be probably around when this podcast is coming out. We're going to be starting Power Monkey Live, which is going to be workouts and Q&As and roundtable discussions with a different Power Monkey coach every day over the course of the next month. So maybe some workouts, but more informational, lessons and things like that. But we're really going to try to have our coaches reach out to the community in a new way. So check out for some information on Power Monkey Live coming out in the next couple of days.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm really looking forward to that. As you mentioned, Dave, it's an opportunity for us to continue doing what we at Power Monkey all love to do, which is, more than just coming up with workouts and taking athletes through workouts, but teaching them, so this is a really cool opportunity, and I look forward to seeing how that goes for sure. So for the listeners out there, hopefully you can check that out, and be sure to head over to powermonkeyfitness.com for other services and upcoming events. Now, those are going to be delayed, of course, at this point, so that'll be a little bit tentative, but also you can keep up with us on our Instagram pages for other regular teaching and technical content at Power Monkey Fitness, also at Dave Durante and at Ollie Chad. We'd love to hear from you as well through our email address, podcast@powermonkeyfitness.com. Let us know if you have any questions or a request for a guest that you'd like us to have on as well. On behalf of Power Monkey Fitness, we're your host. I'm Chad Vaughn with Dave Duraney. And until next time, stay safe out there, guys. And thanks for listening.